Hello, I'm Jethwaney. I'm going to talk to you about crisis communication and we shall discuss today a few things relating to this, which will include defining crisis, the various classification of crisis, various phases in a crisis, crisis principles, message action plan, role of media in a crisis and reasons for failure in a crisis, and we shall touch upon many case studies. Now, we all know that crisis and life are synonymous. I don't think there's any life which is bereft of crisis. But when we are handling a crisis as part of corporate communication on behalf of companies, on behalf of people, individuals, nations, is slightly different than how we do it in our personal lives. In our personal life, when we are accosted with a crisis, the immediate fallout is that we panic, we lose reason, we are not reasonable, and we think that life has come to an end. But life is such that we get on with life, and whatever the kind of crisis, there's an inner resonance, inner resilience which makes us get over that crisis. Similarly, when a crisis happens in a company, the person in charge of crisis handling often is the crisis communicator, who is the top management, can be a CEO, can be a financial person, who is aided and advised by the corporate communication person. As faculty of corporate communication, it's important for us to understand various kinds of crisis, and also when we are teaching our students crisis communication, it cannot be just theoretical. It's very important that we tell our students to track crisis, various kinds of crisis, I'm going to talk to you about that, and how to resolve a crisis through communication tools and strategies. No two crises are same, even if they occur at the same place, because the circumstances would be different, the target audience would be different, and maybe the other stakeholders who are at the end of the receiving the crisis could be different. So let us go on with our lecture. Defining crisis. A crisis can be defined as an adverse event, a great or sudden calamity that needs immediate resolution. If a crisis does not need addressing, it's not crisis in the first place. And crisis can be of various kinds. In fact, Hill and Knowlton, which was the first public relations consultancy set up in America more than 100 years ago, have done a lot of work on classification of crisis, and they broadly divided the crisis into four major classifications. One is the exploding crisis, in which they have included natural disasters, earthquakes, droughts, famines, which are also termed as acts of nature or acts of God. 2. Immediate crisis, which are also called the man-made crisis, in which scandals, scams, moral, ethical issues are included. 3. Building crisis. These are crises, as the name suggests, which take time to build over, and in this they have included industrial unrest, lockouts, strikes, etc., which are also man-made, but then they give you little time to prepare for such crisis. Finally, the continuous crisis, which are called the perennial crisis, which have become perennial, like death, disease, degradation, environment issues, many other issues like health issues, which are long drawn but also need resolution. Now, whenever crisis happens, we generally divide it into three phases: pre-crisis, crisis period, and post-crisis. For example, if we are dealing with a natural disaster, it does come suddenly, but thanks to the science and technology, we also get to know that there is an imminence of certain disasters. Could be an earthquake, not necessarily an earthquake, but it could be a drought situation, it could be a flooding situation, it could be a cyclone, And there are many case studies to suggest that thanks to the Met department, many tragedies have been averted, human loss has been averted because people were alerted on time. You would recall a few years ago we had knowledge about that a cyclone was about to come in Odisha, and all the people who were supposedly to be at the receiving end were informed, and thanks to the mobile phones, people were able to be reached through the mobile phones, and they were rescued. They were sent to safer places. And I can tell you that in that cyclone, it came, it went away without hardly any human loss. So this is a pre-phase time when you must inform and educate the people so that they can avert the loss due to a crisis. And when a crisis occurs, what is that we are supposed to inform the people, with stakeholders? The rescue operations, the mitigation of the crisis, and the succor and the help which is required or which is needed for the people at the receiving end. Finally, the post-crisis. The resettlement and rehabilitation issues must be informed to the people at large and also the people who are at the receiving end. In fact, a crisis management plan has to be worked in advance so that it looks at three things basically. What we term also as the trichor of communication: medium, message, and target audience. What is the medium which you are going to use? Who are your target audience? And what message are you going to tell them? If all these three synergize, the real communication has happened. And when you talk about the crisis, you have to bear in mind that each company, each crisis has own kind of a message action plan. For example, if we have to work on a message plan for a nuclear plant, so obviously it will be very different from a disaster which might happen in a steel plant. So your communication plan has to resonate with the kind of crisis which you are dealing with. One thing which is very important in a crisis is that media really feeds on crisis. Whether you like it or not, whether you inform media or not, media is going to acquire a center stage in times of crisis. Especially so if the company for which you are working on a plan is in a public domain, is a large company, or if the crisis is of a national magnitude, or when the human life is involved. From the media's perspective, we have to realize that media is supposedly to be a watchdog for society. It's a job of the media to inform, educate the people, and also question those in authority who are in charge of handling the crisis. I shall come to the media part a little later. Before that, let me talk to you about the 4 principles of crisis communication, or rather effective crisis communication, which have been put forward by James E. Groening, one of the living legend in public relations, corporate communication. He talks about the relationship principle in a crisis. An organization can withstand crisis if it has well-established relationship with its target audience or stakeholders. Now, a company or a government has been in business for long. People have experience with that company or the government. So they have certain image or certain idea about how the company has been doing and how what kind of relationship they had, what kind of experience they had. That really comes to your rescue in case you have been able to create a relationship with them on a long-term basis. I'll give you an example of Cadbury's case study. If you recall, I think about 10 years ago, we had this case of worms in the Cadbury chocolates, and there was a couple of bars, chocolates had worms crawling in somewhere in Maharashtra, and the newspapers picked up the story, and it became a huge communication crisis, not only a communication problem, it becomes a crisis for the company per se. Now, how do you respond to a crisis is very important. Now, immediately when this crisis occurred, it became public. It happened to be just before a festival season of Diwali, where Cadbury's normally makes a lot of sales of its products. And the immediate response, as in the case of human beings, is that we avoid, evade, pass on the responsibility. Cadbury company also did just the same. They said that this cannot happen. Our systems are very foolproof. And if at all, if the worms have crawled in, it must be at the shelves of those retailers who are, selling the Cadbury chocolates. Now, having said that, they didn't realize that an FMCG product like a chocolate can be sold only through retail outlets, and they put off thousands of retailers who took it as an affront, and they told them that they were no more interested to sell the chocolates. They've been selling for years together, and when there are no worms in anything else, how could they crawl in the Cadbury chocolates? So they annoyed a very important stakeholder in the supply chain. In the meantime, the Food and Drug Administration in Mumbai, they made a visit to one of their plants in Maharashtra, and they found that the chocolates were being wrapped, by hand. It was not an automatic. The wrapping was in by hand. So obviously there was a chance of contamination when you're using hands and when you're using in an open place. Now Cadbury's did not know, they knew that they were caught on the wrong foot. So obviously, as communicators, we are supposed to, or we are required to tell what you're doing. The problem was something else. They had to sort out the problem. They had to ensure that the worm, that next time when they are wrapping the chocolates, it had to be foolproof. It had to be without contamination. It had not to leave any room for such kind of contamination. So almost they took about a few months to decide that the chocolates had to be wrapped in a double packing, and they did it. And it was the job of the communicators, especially the advertisers, to inform and educate the people that the chocolate now was doubly packed and there was no issue of contamination. But in the meantime, they lost face, they lost credibility. So they came out with a project called Project Vishwas. It was a campaign in which they informed the people through paid advertising, half-page ads they issued in various newspapers, telling that now onwards this is going to be doubly packed and there's no question of contamination. After all, it's a question of trust we have built over a period of more than 100 years. But still they did not find much response as they had expected. They again thought about a different strategy to reach out to the people, to gain credibility of a lost market. And some of you would recall, they involved the cine star Amitabh Bachchan, who was in a series of 3 ads. In the first ad, he was shown shoving a chocolate piece in the mouth of a small child, presumably his granddaughter, and she said that no, there's something in that, my mama tells me not to eat chocolate. And Amitabh Bachchan says, no, it only has the cocoa, the milk and all the goodness of a chocolate. And the second or third series, he was face to camera, and he was talking to us, and he said that the Cadbury guys came to me and asked me if I could tell their story to you. And then he was shown going to the Cadbury chocolate factory, where we could see animated discussion with the people. And then he was shown picking up a small chocolate piece and eating, and said, after all, it's a question of more than 50 years of faith in Cadbury's. And that was really a clincher. That really made a difference in bridging the gap between the stakeholders, the people who enjoy the chocolates and the company. And after all, people also thought that the company would not do it intentionally. It must be a one-on kind of a questions. It was an aberration. It was not really a general practice. And we know that within 6 months' time, as Cadbury suggested, they were able to get their lost market. I'll show you the last clip of Amitabh Bachchan to make the connect.
मुझे आपसे कुछ कहना है। जिस काम में मनुष्य की अंतरात्मा उसके साथ ना हो, उस काम को करने से उसे सब कुछ मिल सकता है, मन की शांति नहीं मिल सकती। इसलिए जब कैडबरी वालों ने मुझे कहा कि उनकी बात मैं आप तक पहुंचाऊं, तो 55 सालों से कैडबरी खाने वाला मैं भी थोड़ा सा हिचकिचाया। मैंने उनसे एक सवाल पूछा कि क्या इसके बाद मैं चैन की नींद सो पाऊंगा या नहीं। तो जवाब में वो मुझे अपनी फैक्ट्री ले गए और मुझे अपनी इंटरनेशनल टेक्नोलॉजी, अपने कड़े क्वालिटी कंट्रोल्स और डबल प्रोटेक्शन पैकेजिंग दिखाई। आजकल मैं बड़ी चैन की नींद सो रहा हूं।
अब आपकी फेवरेट कैडबरी डेयरी मिल्क नए प्योरिटी सील्ड पैक में।
So this is the relationship principle. The second principle which Mr. Gruning talks about is the accountability principle, in which he says that an organization should accept responsibility for a crisis even if it was not its fault. When a crisis happens, one really doesn't know who was responsible, who was the victim, who is the abettor, but it could be a question of human life, it could be a question of loss of money, it could be a question of a huge disaster. So you cannot be, and it's very difficult to know exactly who was responsible for that. So that is not very important that you start finding who was responsible. It's important that if you are in charge, that you take the full responsibility of handling the crisis. The rest can take care of by itself little later. And here he talks about that sometimes you find that there's a product recall, or there could be a sabotage, there could be extortionist threat. So all these things are possible. So the company which is in charge of that must take the responsibility squarely to handle the crisis. Here I'll give you a very interesting example of Johnson & Johnson company, which has become a kind of a benchmark in crisis communication post 1982. The story goes that in 1982, I think Radio Chicago announced in one of its bulletin that about 6 people were feared dead after taking Tylenol. Now Johnson & Johnson has a number of product lines, including some OTC drugs, over-the-counter drugs, which includes Tylenol. Tylenol is a mild analgesic drug which people can buy over the counter. We have Crocin or Saridon here in India, and this is could be taken by anyone who has a mild fever or a headache, so on and so forth. Now when this story came in the radio, so obviously the company felt extremely bad. They pressed the panic button, and the basic idea behind the immediate communication was that the 6 should not become 600, 6,000 and 6 lakhs. It's quite possible, they had no idea how did it come about, how can people die of Tylenol, which batch had a problem, or was it that all Tylenol had a problem. They did not get into the P's and Q's of this problem, but their immediate job was to inform, educate the people per se to stop taking Tylenol. See, they use all kind of media, the mass media, the interpersonal media, the doctors' media, the chemists, with just 2 liners. We say that 6 people feared death taking Tylenol. Please stop taking. We are investigating. And obviously, they then had a committee, committee which went into that. But the immediate, thought was that it has happened today, it can happen tomorrow. They were never able to get to know who did it, but they found little later that one batch in one of the factories was laced with poison. Somebody must have done the sabotage. But then the bigger question was that it has happened to them, it can happen to anyone. What is that which could be done that this kind of eventuality was not there at all in the pharma industry? So their group which they had made included a lot of people from the civil society, from the public opinion makers, from the lawmakers, from the chemists, the doctors, and they came out with something which has become a benchmark in the pharma industry and also in crisis communication. So they went to the Senate, they went to the Congress, and the law was passed that henceforth all medicines will come in tamper-proof packaging. And you would have seen that now even when you are paying just about 10 rupees for a tablet package, it comes into a foil which is tamper-proof. So this decision was taken all over, first in USA, then later everywhere else, that medicines will not be sold loose in the market. Before that, it was how it was sold, but then onwards a law was passed, and this is kind of an international law, except when they are selling to institutions, they might have big jars and all, but when they are selling it over the counter, it comes in tamper-proof. So here's a case where the company was able to turn a crisis into an opportunity. Opportunity not for their own sake, opportunity for the public good. And it is seen as a benchmark in crisis communication, and I haven't seen really any book which has a chapter in crisis communication and it does not talk about the J&J story of 1982. So that is called the accountability principle in crisis communication. The third principle Gruning talks is the disclosure principle. In a crisis, an organization should disclose all it knows about a crisis or problem. If it does not have the input immediately, it must share with the people as soon as it has the input on a crisis. It does not really happen, but this is an ideal situation because we know about the crisis through the media, and we understand that media is generally event driven. Once a crisis is there, there's so much input, there's so much bombardment about information from left, right and center. Once the crisis is over, media also generally forgets and they are getting on with another crisis. It may be good for the company, but from the interest of the company's point of view, and also because now media is not just mass media per se, there's huge digital media which has become so powerful. So it's very important that the companies must at least put all that information on their website. And I'd like to tell you here that a few years ago at the Indian Institute of Mass Communication, where I taught for a long time, so we conducted a research on the changing sources of news for the journalists, because I had this gut feel that now journalists have different sources of news other than press releases or press conferences. And we did this with one of the largest PR consultancy, and we had covered more than 300 journalists in this news, research from all over the country. And one thing which was very interesting, one of the insights and the finding was that nowadays more than 80% journalists go to the websites, go to the net to take ideas about various stories and what is trending. And also for doing their research on various issues, they go to the net. And in case of crisis, the journalists, I think more than 90% journalists said that the first thing they do is to go to the website of the company or the ministry or the government where the crisis has occurred. So imagine how important have websites become, and they should be updated continuously. And in case of a crisis, it's very important that whatever you want to say about that crisis per se, the spokesperson's voice, put it immediately on the site. That will solve half the problems. The fourth principle that Gruning is talking about is the symmetrical communication principle, in which he is trying to tell us that the public interest should be considered in equal importance to organization's intent. Generally what happens when a crisis occurs, as I said earlier, the company tries to camouflage, gets a little scared about the repercussions, how media is going to handle it. So they don't tell all the facts. But here Gruning is saying that it has to be as important as the public's interest to know about what has happened. If all these four principles are taken into account, I'm sure the people who are in charge of handling crisis can do a good job. Now, following are very critical when a crisis or emergency occurs, the enormity of the disaster or the loss of human life. In fact, human life gives you extreme public opinion. It is said that public opinion swings like a pendulum when human life is involved, because everybody is emotional when they see blood, gore, the bodies of the people. There's a lot of emotion, and which is generally covered by media, and that's how images are made and unmade in the public sphere. So the enormity of crisis is very important, and the perceived abettors and the victims. When a crisis happens, it's very difficult to know who started the crisis. Even if you know, one can't be sure. But immediately perceptions float around that so and so has started, so and so company has started. So there's a abettor and there's a victim. It's quite possible. Reverse could also be true sometimes. And the perceptions about the crisis. Now, what is really a perception? Perception is the first initial thoughts which people may have, which might have been by way of watching the initial images or initial information from the media, and over a period of time when there's a lot of discussion, a lot of new facts come, the perceptions turn into opinion, and the opinions turn into conviction, and convictions turn into volition. So the lesson for the corporate communication persons, those who are handling crisis, is that don't allow perceptions to turn into convictions and volitions. Very difficult to change. So the moral of the story in a crisis is that as soon as a crisis breaks, must know what are people thinking about it, what are the perceptions floating around, and in case what is being understood, what is being said is not right, because you have the facts as a company, you must try and see that you map those perceptions and bring those new facts. But you allow it to happen, then it's very difficult to bring about a change. The other thing important after crisis is that how media has covered and what is media stand. Now, ideally media should be objective, but media also comprises of human beings. They have their own issues, they have their own understanding. They are from the same planet as we are, they come from the same milieu they do. So subjectivity is a part of the coverage, even if media would like you to believe that they are very objective. There's nothing called objectivity. In fact, if you ask me, Prabhash Joshi once said, who was the editor of Jansatta, he said, absolute objectivity is absolute farce. It's just not possible. So after a crisis, you have to look at how media has covered and what is media stand. When I say media, I'm not talking in terms of monolith media. See a cross section of media in terms of the genre, in terms of within the genre you see, because every media has a certain political and other viewpoints, certain kind of a viewpoint. So it's very important for you to look at more than one medium to see what is being said. So as a crisis communicator, it's important for them to look at the media who are very negative, media who are positive, media who are neutral, and what could possibly be the reasons for negativity or neutrality. If it is negative, it's quite possible that they did not get enough information. It's quite possible there's some inherent bias. So it's important for you that you put your crisis team to get in touch with that media and try and give your perspective to appear in that media. There's nothing wrong media being critical, but if they do not give the perspective of the client, the perspective of the company which is being criticized, that is being unfair. And if one medium is not giving you, it's not difficult to go to the other medium to get it done. And as I said a few minutes ago, that your own website can be your very important medium in a crisis. So try and give as much as you can. Even small clips of your CEO, the spokesperson, could be put 30 to 60 seconds, you're giving your point of view. I can assure you that you would see that there are hundreds of news channels in this country. A few dozens would definitely download and relay what you want to say. So that's very important, that your communication channels have to be open, they have to be consistent, they have to be speedy, they have to be honest, they have to be truthful. That's what is important. So when you're teaching crisis communication in your class, it's very important for you to tell your students that every day in the morning, at least half an hour to 1 hour, even if there's no crisis, because crisis communication is a very important part of corporate communication, that a library class or watching the media, trailing the media, tracking the media in the morning is very important. And as a faculty, when you see that some crisis has erupted, you have a good idea that it's going to go on for a longer time. So make your class, turn your class into smaller groups, give them the exercise, tell them to continually track the media across various genres, digital, electronic, print, and the company website, make their own understanding of what the crisis is all about, who are the possible stakeholders, and what is their judgment about how the crisis was handled. In fact, it's very important for us to groom our students in crisis communication, because that's what they're going to do once they become professionals. They join the companies, they join the consultancies, or they join the government. That's a very important part of it. And when you tell them to do that on a continuous basis, they become analytical, they understand the crisis, they understand the stakeholders, and how in a crisis many people are not probably even required to be in a crisis become part of the players. There's a very interesting saying in Hindi, Begani Shadi Mein Abdullah Diwana. So you find that in a crisis almost anyone, everyone has a wish list or has a kind of a suggestion to give you, and that happens, and that you can get to know only when you're tracking crisis. So this should be part of your crisis teaching in a class, that you've taught them for the basics, the concepts, maybe for a 1 or 2 sessions, give the exercise to the students, and the crisis could be different kinds as we discussed before, tell them to track it, and maybe 1 or 2 weeks let the students come and present the crisis, and you see that how different groups have different understanding of the crisis and the lessons learned. Some of you might have read my textbook, Corporate Communication, which has a large chapter on crisis communication, and almost every chapter at the end of it has critical thinking exercises. It also has questions, simulations. So my request to you would be, in case you follow that and give students continuous simulations or exercises, it will be a good idea. In case you think while you're teaching that there's no crisis which is happening, it really doesn't happen though. So try and simulate a situation, create a simulation, a kind of a disaster. It can be political, economic, it can be a natural disaster, and give that to the students to respond to that simulation and give you the communication solutions. In case we don't make this sessions interesting, students lose interest. It's very important for us to continuously, as faculty and as students, we develop our own understanding of the crisis. The more we exercise, the better we have understanding about crisis communication, handling, and principles. Now, 2 aspects are very important from a disaster manager's perspective. When I say disaster manager, what I have in mind is the person who's handling the crisis. How do you respond to the victims? And 2, are you communicating what you're doing to bring succor? Because in communication, it's very important that we inform, educate, inform on a very continuous basis. I remember many years ago, I think it must be about 20 years ago, Coal India had a very major crisis at their Raniganj colliery, somewhere in West Bengal, Bihar border, in which 72 miners were fear trapped. And that was a time, I think it was more than 20 years, in the early 90s, when we did not even have the satellite channels, we just had Doordarshan. And I really give it to the management of the Coal India department, or the Coal India top management, that they involved the entire nation into the crisis handling. I remember Mr. Narayanan was the chief of the CEO of Coal India, and he went from his corporate office and camped near the Raniganj colliery, And it was difficult because this coal mine was flooded with water, and it was difficult to get these 72 miners back, and they were able to find 70 were there, 2 were missing, but after some time they found those 2 had also gone on a furlough, so nobody was dead. Now the idea was how to reach these miners, and we were watching, all looking at Doordarshan, how that was a time when there used to be only 2 bulletins of Doordarshan. It was not 24/7 kind of a scenario, but every bulletin will have some information, some news on Coal India, and it went on for more than a week till the time the team was able to reach out to the miners. They made a hole and they made a cage like a thing, and the best part which I saw was, I don't remember the name of the gentleman, but the guy who was in charge of the Raniganj colliery, he was a Sikh gentleman, he sat inside that cage, went in and came out. The whole idea was to tell those millions of people who are watching and those thousands of people, lakhs of people who work in Coal India, that the passage was safe. If anyone who would suffer would be the CEO of the head of the Raniganj colliery, because he went inside, came out safe, and then one by one all the miners were rescued, and there were thousands of people waiting outside, and they were sent to the hospital. Then they were given family time together with an extra LTC. I mean, it was handled so beautifully, and a lot of credit goes to the communication team, which not only involved the entire nation in the rescue drama, it also involved more than, I think that time they had about 6 to 7 lakh employees who were working in different collieries. They involved them, kept them informed about how the colleagues were being looked after. So the whole communication, the crisis was handled on a very happy note, because all were survived. But God forbids, even if there were accidents that some did not survive, but the communication did not fail. So it's very important in a crisis time that communication has to come center stage. You have to be very careful about choosing your target audience, choosing your medium vis-a-vis the target audience, and telling them in a very simple, precise, spadish manner what is that you want to communicate to them, because communication is about what you're doing. It's not about communication per se. Another case study which comes to mind, which I would say, I'm giving you all good case studies, the bad case study, the worst case study I have seen in my entire career of teaching, and also you can say the last 35 years. This happened unfortunately in 1984, the Bhopal gas tragedy, and you all know, I don't need to get into the history, that this problem still is seeking resolution. Thousands of people who died, thousands of them who survived, and they still have not got the succor, because it went into, I really don't know what kind of bureaucratic red tapeism, that the problem still continues. Not only communication was poor, no one really knew what was happening. Even the people, the survivors and the children who are being born, that they still, some of them are maimed, they haven't got their succor as yet, they haven't got the compensation as yet. So there are 2 extremes. I gave you the Johnson & Johnson case study, which is seen as a benchmark in great communication study, and a Bhopal gas tragedy, which is a worst kind of crisis communication. I remember that, I'm sure you too, that every year when there's an anniversary, there are people who will come do a march, they'll do a candle march, but nothing seems to be happening, which is really, really unfortunate. So this can be taken as a worst case of crisis handling, at least in this country. The person who was supposedly the head of the Union Carbide, now Union Carbide no more owns this company, Anderson, he died last year in America. There was a notice against him. In fact, he had come also, but nothing really happened. I would like you to refer this case study. It's a very long case study in the books. Many books my book has, to get more ideas about how badly it was handled. Going back to what I said, that media acquires center stage in times of crisis, and the earlier you understand, the better it is. Its watchdog function, it must inform, educate the people, The other could be that media also has own agenda. In a crisis situation, a lot of good things also happen which media does not see, because at least we have this grudge as communicators that media only sees, it only smells bad, it does not see what good work is being done. So if the mainstream media is pulling you, pulling the companies, you always have your website, you have the digital media, you can reach out to your stakeholders, but we have to see that media also has a role to play. Media, when things happen normally, they are supposed to happen. It's only when things don't happen normally, the media must bring it to the public domain. That's the thing which you must keep in view. But now with the digital media, you see that the whole paradigm of communication has changed. The live chat rooms, and there are so many people who have so many opinions. Just to give you an idea on the digital space, it is said that about 1 billion pages are added every day. Thousands of hours of films, videos are uploaded on YouTube in a hope that someone someday somewhere is going to read or watch what I have done. And read we do, watch we do. So imagine what it means for communication, especially crisis communicators, that journalists who are seen as opinion makers for long are not only the opinion makers, there are so many accidental opinion makers on the digital space which you have to see, which you have to worry about. The crisis can be financial in nature, crisis can be political in nature, the crisis can be economic in nature. See the kind of eruption of information, I would say information overload over the digital media. So on the one hand, we can say there's so much information. On the other hand, we can say that it's hugely a difficult issue to handle so much information at the same time in the real time. Now, the stereotypes for media and organizations in times of crisis. There's generally a kind of love-hate relationship which happens between an average journalist and average corporate communication person. And the belief is that from the journalist perspective is that the corporate communication persons are going to hide facts, and the corporate communication persons feel that journalists only smell bad. They are never going to tell the right story. So it's kind of from journalist perspective, what is hidden is news, the rest is public relations or corporate communication they are not interested in. They always think what comes from a company's perspective, from the supply side of information, has more than meets the eye, and the company is out to hide something. Many hide, but we have to realize that in this time of information age, the information is not just with one person, it's with at least more than two persons. In a company there are thousands of people, there are hundreds of people in the neighborhood, and you cannot hide truth for long. I believe that truth has this uncanny character of surfacing. So if you don't speak the truth, it's going to surface anyways. So it's in the fitness of things that the companies who are handling crisis communication, the departments who are handling, must come out with truth, because truth is going to surface anyways. So when you speak, after all, mistakes happen, machines don't make mistake, people make mistake, people are going to forgive you if you accept that this mistake was made, this was man-made. But when you camouflage truth, it's going to be at the risk and cost of the company's image. That's what you have to understand. Now let's look at why does a medium or a media behaves the way it does, and why does a corporate or a company on the supply side of information, be it government or a company or an association, behaves the way it does. So I've done a little exercise for you, anatomy of a medium and anatomy of a company. When I say an organization, you can take it to cover all kinds of organizations. So let us look at the anatomy of a medium. A medium or a media is in the business of news. So obviously the fodder is news. They have to bring out a 36-pager, 48-pager or 24-pager newspaper every day. 24/7 news on a news channel. For a 24/7 news channel, they have to make at least 8 to 10 hours of news every day, the rest is repeated, which means what? If the going is good, your good story is repeated a number of times. But if the going is bad, the bad story is repeated more often. That is where the problem arises. Then you have to realize that newspapers or the media, they are in competition with others. The breaking news syndrome. Everybody wants to be in breaking news. Sometimes it's hilarious. How can a very simple news be a breaking news? But that's what it is. Just to attract your attention for the TRPs. There are so many breaking news in a single bulletin every day. You'd also realize that the media also has certain corporate responsibilities. We all know that it's not just what appears is important, what does not appear is also important. If you look at the sociology of the media, if you look at the ownership patterns, 99% of the media is owned by big businessmen and other vested interests. So obviously, you find that some news appears more frequently, others news don't appear at all. So there are people who tell them that so and so news will not appear. Obviously, when you have 10 factories and the 11th factory is media factory, so you find that the news about other factories will not appear at least in those factories, at least in that medium. So as a faculty of communication, especially corporate communication, teaching crisis communication, a good hang of sociology of the media, the ownership patterns is very important. And that is what you must share with your students also. So when they are doing a dissection or deconstruction of a crisis, encourage them to do vis-a-vis different genre and also different medium within that medium with the sociology, ownership in mind, so that they understand what is appearing and what is not appearing and why it is happening so. Once they have a hang of it, they can never fail in their life being crisis communicators. But you also have to realize that it cannot be always a media or a medium cannot always be one track. It has its own reputation to guard. It cannot be biased all the time. There can be small biases here and there, but not always. They have, because they live on credibility and they sustain on credibility. You also have to realize that when a journalist has not got in touch with you, it's quite possible that he tried to get in touch with you, but you didn't respond or you didn't pick up the phone. They have deadlines to meet. So don't cry because your idea or your perspective did not appear. You also have to realize that journalists, reporters are also human beings with the same subjectivity, rational and emotional sides. When they go and cover a disaster, they are human beings too. There's no closet back at home where they keep their value systems, their biases back home. It doesn't happen like that. But remember, I'm quoting somebody who wrote that those who use ink by gallons and newsprint by metric tons have to be taken seriously. What appears in the media has a certain kind of a credibility because it has appeared in black and white. A large number of people believe what appears in the media because as human beings, we know about the world per se through media stimuli. Whatever is happening around us, our knowledge source is media. So we believe what appears in media to a large extent. Now let's look at the anatomy of an organization. An organization has certain core competence in one or more areas. It has worked very hard in managing its reputation and very protective about it. Organizations per se really dread crisis. They hate crisis. An organization has many stakeholders to answer to, from employees to supply chain to wholesalers, dealers. There could be different organizations that would have different kind of service organization would have different, political organizations would have different. So, the various kinds of stakeholders they have to answer to. Often organizations do not have a media policy or communication policy to handle. The slip therefore often shows. Despite a general preparedness about a crisis, they are not really ready for a crisis. You do not find organization doing a mock drill as the army, air force they do it. It is not done. You would have seen a small thing like every office would have a fire extinguisher, but believe you me, how many times there is a drill to tell people in case of fire how to use that fire extinguisher. We do not do that. So, it is very important, in order to be good in crisis, you have to continuously make a drill to see whether you stand to that standard. So, generally what you find that in organizations, people behave as they behave normally, avoid, evade, pass on the buck. So, that is not which is going to take them far. It is very important that there is not only readiness for the crisis, one must know how to handle a crisis. In a crisis, imagery has a very important role to play. The images of people, how they are shown, especially after natural disasters, it can be very unnerving, but it can also be very disastrous for the people or the organization which is in charge of handling a crisis. I remember when 9/11 happened in America, not a single body was shown on the roads, not a drop of blood was shown. It is not that the media is very responsible, so they did not do it. They all were issued an advisory not to show to increase panic among the people. I remember Times magazine came out with a special issue after 9/11, and it did not include a single advertisement because no advertiser were interested to be seen as trying to be in a magazine which had a higher circulation. They did not want to be seen in a negative sense, and many advertisers withdrew their advertisements during prime time news bulletins. And 9/11, some of you would know, happened with a lot of meticulousness on the part of the perpetrators of violence. When one tower went down, there was a difference of 20 minutes between the second tower to be raised down, and that 20 minutes they said was done so that the media was able to reach on time and the people were able to see it happening live on their television sets, which people did. 9/11 in America, they write month first and the date later. So, this happened on 11th of September, and they chose 11th of September because 9/11 is the emergency number in America. They wanted to create a virtual emergency for all time so that people never forget what they were capable of. They did it. Now, just to close the lecture, let me just recap what we discussed. We discussed about the definition of crisis communication. We discussed various kinds of crisis. We discussed various principles in a crisis situation, and we also discussed the anatomy of an organization and the media. Just to end my lecture, failure in a crisis happens only because you did not understand the crisis per se, or you did not give those initial few moments how the crisis has to be handled. The stakeholders were not defined. You were not speedy with your communication. You did not have the right spokesperson, or you looked at long-term goals than short-term goals. Thank you.